Picture this. You're standing in your own driveway, watching three HOA board members demand access to your private property, threatening to fine you $500 every single day until you comply. They want your gate code. They want to walk through your backyard whenever they please. And they believe a single line buried in page 47 of your community's covenant gives them the right to do it. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness the most audacious display of HOA overreach I've ever encountered, and the brilliant legal loophole that brought these power-hungry board members to their knees. This isn't just another HOA horror story. This is about a homeowner who refused to be bullied, who dug deeper than anyone expected, and who discovered that sometimes the very rules meant to control you can become the weapons that set you free. What started as a simple privacy fence installation spiraled into a neighborhood-wide battle that exposed corruption, revealed illegal surveillance, and ultimately led to the complete restructuring of an entire HOA board. The homeowner in this story didn't just win, they obliterated the opposition so thoroughly that the story became legendary in property law circles. But before we get to that sweet, satisfying victory, you need to understand exactly how three people with clipboards and inflated egos managed to turn a quiet suburban street into a war zone. Meet Sarah Chen, a 42-year-old software engineer who thought she'd found her dream home in Willowbrook Estates, an upscale planned community in Northern Virginia. After years of apartment living and cramped condos, Sarah finally had what she'd always wanted. A corner lot with a sprawling backyard, mature oak trees, and enough space for the vegetable garden she'd been planning since college. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just any subdivision. This was a premium community where homes started at $800,000, where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine, and where the HOA dues of $350 a month supposedly guaranteed that property values would only go up. The community featured a clubhouse, tennis courts, a swimming pool, and walking trails that wound through carefully maintained green spaces. For the first 18 months, Sarah lived in suburban bliss. She transformed her backyard into an oasis, installing raised garden beds, a small greenhouse, and a beautiful stone patio. Her tomatoes were the envy of the neighborhood. Her herb garden supplied half the block, and her weekend barbecues became legendary among the few neighbors who actually knew how to have fun. But Sarah's paradise came with watchers. The Willowbrook Estates HOA board operated with the efficiency of a small government and the compassion of a tax collector. At the helm was Margaret Whitfield, a 73-year-old retired principal who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Margaret had been HOA president for 12 consecutive years, running unopposed in every election because, frankly, nobody else wanted to deal with the drama. Margaret's lieutenants were equally devoted to their cause. There was Robert Blackstone, a 68-year-old former insurance adjuster who served as the HOA's compliance officer, spending his retirement driving slowly through the neighborhood with a digital camera and a measuring tape. Robert could spot an unauthorized garden gnome from 3 houses away and had memorized every paragraph of the community's 89-page covenant document. The third member of this triumvirate was Linda Morrison, a 59-year-old real estate agent who served as the HOA treasurer and had an uncanny ability to interpret any rule in the most restrictive way possible. Linda believed that property values were directly correlated with the number of violation notices issued per quarter, and her spreadsheets tracking neighborhood infractions were color-coded by severity. Stay with me because what happens next will make your blood boil and show you exactly why even the most reasonable people can be pushed too far. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late September when Sarah decided her backyard needed more privacy. The corner lot that had initially seemed like such a blessing came with an unexpected drawback. Her entire backyard was visible from the street, the walking trail, and 2 neighboring properties. Every time she tried to relax in her garden, she felt like she was performing for an audience. After researching her options, Sarah settled on a beautiful cedar privacy fence that would enclose her backyard without blocking the mature trees she loved so much. She spent weeks choosing the design, selecting materials, and finding a contractor. The fence would be 6 feet tall, constructed with high-quality cedar boards, and designed with decorative post caps that matched the architectural style of her home. Before breaking ground, Sarah did what any responsible homeowner would do. She pulled her property survey, confirmed her lot lines, and submitted a detailed application to the HOA for fence approval. The application included architectural drawings, material specifications, contractor credentials, and a timeline for completion. She even included photos showing how the fence would blend with the existing landscape. The response came back within a week. Approved. Sarah was thrilled. She scheduled the installation for early October, arranged to take time off work to supervise the project, and even planned a small celebration dinner for when the fence was completed. The contractor arrived on schedule, the weather cooperated, and within 3 days, Sarah had the private backyard sanctuary she'd been dreaming about. The fence was beautiful. The cedar had a warm, natural tone that complemented her home's brick exterior. The contractor had been meticulous about alignment and spacing, and the decorative caps added an elegant touch that elevated the entire design. Sarah's vegetable garden now felt like a secret oasis. Her patio became a true outdoor room. And for the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, she could relax in her backyard without feeling like she was on display. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. You won't believe what happened next, and how quickly 3 people with too much time and too little common sense managed to turn her dream into a nightmare. 3 weeks after the fence installation, Sarah found an envelope in her mailbox that would change everything. The return address showed the Willowbrook Estates HOA, and inside was a formal violation notice that made her blood run cold. According to the notice, Sarah's fence violated multiple community standards, and she had 30 days to remove it entirely or face daily fines of $500. The violations listed were breathtaking in their creativity. Improper height, unapproved materials, installation without permits, obstruction of common area sight lines, and violation of the Open Community Character Clause. Sarah read the notice 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. Her fence had been approved. She had the paperwork to prove it. The installation met every specification in her approved application. But according to Margaret Whitfield's signature on the violation notice, none of that mattered. The next morning, Sarah called the HOA management company to schedule a meeting with the board. She was calm, professional, and confident that this was simply a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a brief conversation and the presentation of her approval documentation. She had no idea that she was about to discover just how far some people will go to assert their authority over their neighbors. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening in the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse. A sterile room with fluorescent lighting and the kind of industrial carpeting that belonged in an office building from 1987. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a folder with every document related to her fence installation. The original application, the approval letter, the contractor's permits, the property survey, and even photographs showing the fence's compliance with community standards. Margaret Whitfield sat at the head of a conference table like a judge preparing to deliver a death sentence. Robert Blackstone had positioned himself to Margaret's right, armed with a tablet computer and what appeared to be a magnifying glass. Linda Morrison flanked Margaret's left side, shuffling through a stack of papers with the dramatic flair of someone who believed they were about to deliver devastating evidence. The meeting began with Margaret's announcement that Sarah's fence was fundamentally incompatible with the community's vision and would need to be removed immediately. When Sarah presented her approval documentation, Margaret barely glanced at the papers before dismissing them as preliminary approval only, and claimed that final approval required an additional inspection that Sarah had never requested. Sarah kept her composure and asked to see the specific covenant language that required this additional inspection. Margaret's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. The inspection requirement was implied in the approval process. and any reasonable homeowner should have understood that preliminary approval was not the same as final approval. Robert Blackstone then unveiled his tablet, which contained dozens of photographs of Sarah's fence taken from every conceivable angle. He had measured the fence height at 17 different points and claimed that several sections exceeded the 6-foot maximum by as much as half an inch. He had photographed the fence from the walking trail and determined that it obstructed sight lines that were essential for community safety. Linda Morrison's contribution was perhaps the most creative. She had researched property records and discovered that Sarah's fence was positioned 3 inches closer to the street than the established fence line pattern maintained by other corner lot owners. This 3-inch discrepancy, according to Linda, violated the neighborhood harmony provisions of the community covenant. This is where things get absolutely insane, and where Sarah realized she wasn't dealing with reasonable people who had made an honest mistake. When Sarah pointed out that her fence matched the exact specifications in her approved application, Margaret announced that the approval had been granted in error by a previous board member who lacked the authority to approve fence installations. This was news to Sarah, who had received the approval from Margaret herself. When Sarah produced a copy of the approval letter bearing Margaret's own signature, the HOA president claimed that she had signed the letter, but that it was conditional approval, contingent on factors that were clearly understood by anyone familiar with HOA procedures. The circular logic was breathtaking. Sarah's fence was approved, but the approval wasn't valid. The fence met all stated requirements, but there were unstated requirements that superseded the stated ones. The board had approved the fence, but they lacked the authority to approve it, except when they had the authority to disapprove it. Sarah left that meeting with a headache and a growing suspicion that this dispute had nothing to do with fence regulations and everything to do with power. But she decided to give the board the benefit of the doubt and requested a written explanation of exactly what modifications would bring her fence into compliance. What came next will show you exactly how petty and vindictive some people can become when they believe their authority is being questioned. The HOA's response arrived via certified mail 5 days later. The board had determined that no modifications could bring Sarah's fence into compliance and that complete removal was the only acceptable solution. Furthermore, the daily fines would begin immediately and would continue until the fence was completely removed and the property returned to its original approved condition. But the real bombshell was buried in the second paragraph. The board claimed that Sarah's fence installation had created a security concern that required them to conduct periodic inspections of her backyard to ensure that no additional unauthorized modifications were made. These inspections would require unrestricted access to her property, and Sarah was directed to provide the HOA with her gate code within 72 hours. Sarah read this paragraph 5 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. The HOA wanted her to remove the fence she had built for privacy and then provide them with unrestricted access to inspect her private backyard whenever they felt it was necessary. The letter went on to explain that the gate code requirement was based on the community access provisions of the covenant, which granted the HOA the right to enter any property for maintenance, inspection, or emergency purposes. Failure to provide the gate code would result in additional fines of $500 per day, starting immediately. Sarah spent the weekend researching HOA law, reading her covenant document, and trying to understand how 3 people with clipboards had managed to turn her life upside down. What she discovered was that HOA covenants are often deliberately vague, giving boards broad discretionary authority that can be interpreted in almost any way they choose. But Sarah also discovered something else. Sometimes the very vagueness that gives HOA boards their power can also be their weakness. Hold on tight because you're about to see how one determined homeowner turned the tables on 3 bullies who thought they could intimidate their way to victory. Monday morning brought another certified letter, this time from the HOA's law firm. The letter formally notified Sarah that her fence was in violation of multiple covenant provisions and that daily fines had begun accumulating. The letter also demanded that she provide gate access immediately or face additional penalties. Sarah's initial reaction was panic. The fines were accumulating at $500 per day for the fence violation and another $500 per day for failure to provide gate access. At $1,000 per day, she was looking at monthly fines of $30,000, more than her mortgage payment. But as Sarah read the lawyer's letter more carefully, she began to notice something interesting. The legal citations were remarkably vague. The covenant sections referenced in the letter used phrases like reasonable community standards and appropriate neighborhood character, without defining what those terms actually meant. Sarah decided it was time to fight back, but she knew she couldn't win this battle by herself. She contacted 3 different attorneys who specialized in HOA law, and their responses were surprisingly consistent. HOA disputes are expensive, time-consuming, and often decided in favor of the association because homeowners can't afford to fight. But the third attorney, David Park, offered Sarah a different perspective. David had spent 15 years representing homeowners against abusive HOA boards, and he had learned that the best defense against HOA overreach was often a thorough understanding of the HOA's own rules. David's first recommendation was that Sarah stop paying the fines. The HOA could claim that fines were accumulating, but they couldn't collect those fines without following specific legal procedures outlined in the covenant. More importantly, David suspected that the HOA was bluffing about their authority to demand gate access. This is where Sarah's story takes a turn that nobody saw coming, and where she discovered that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. David spent the next week conducting what he called a covenant audit, a line-by-line analysis of every provision in the Willowbrook Estate's governing documents. What he found was a masterpiece of legal inconsistency and bureaucratic overreach. The covenant did indeed grant the HOA access rights for maintenance, inspection, and emergency purposes, but it also contained very specific language about how those access rights could be exercised. According to Section 7.3 of the Covenant, the HOA could only enter private property after providing reasonable notice, and could only do so during normal business hours, unless there was a genuine emergency. More importantly, Section 7.3 required that all property inspections be conducted by qualified professionals, and that homeowners receive written reports detailing any violations discovered during the inspection. The HOA couldn't just demand a gate code and then send board members wandering through backyards whenever they felt like it, but David's most significant discovery was in Section 12.1, which outlined the HOA's enforcement procedures. According to this section, the HOA could only impose fines after providing homeowners with a reasonable opportunity to cure any violations. The section defined reasonable opportunity as a minimum of 60 days, during which the homeowner could either correct the violation or request a hearing before the board. Sarah had never been offered a hearing. She had never been given 60 days to cure any violation, and most importantly, she had never actually violated anything because her fence had been properly approved according to the HOA's own procedures. David's audit revealed something even more interesting. Margaret Whitfield had been signing approval letters for fence installations for over 5 years, and many of those approvals had been granted under circumstances identical to Sarah's situation. If Margaret lacked the authority to approve fence installations, then dozens of other homeowners in Willowbrook Estates were also in violation of community standards. What happened when Sarah armed herself with this information will restore your faith in the power of preparation over intimidation. Sarah's response to the HOA came in the form of a 10-page letter that systematically dismantled every claim made by the board. The letter drafted by David Park demanded that the HOA provide legal justification for each fine imposed, explain why Sarah had not been offered a hearing before the fines were imposed, and clarify why the board believed it had the authority to demand unrestricted access to private property. The letter also included a detailed analysis of Margaret Whitfield's approval history, complete with copies of similar fence approvals that had been granted under identical circumstances. If Sarah's fence was in violation of community standards, then the letter demanded to know why dozens of other similar fences had been approved and were still standing. But the letter's most devastating paragraph came at the end, where David Park politely informed the HOA that Sarah would be filing complaints with both the State Attorney General's office and the local building department if the harassment continued. The complaints would allege that the HOA was operating outside its legal authority and was attempting to extort money from homeowners through the imposition of illegal fines. The HOA's response was swift and revealing: complete silence. For 2 weeks, Sarah heard nothing from Margaret Whitfield, Robert Blackstone, or Linda Morrison. The daily fine notices stopped arriving, the certified letters ceased, and the HOA's law firm seemed to have lost interest in the case. Sarah began to hope that her legal response had convinced the board to back down, but she should have known that people who abuse power rarely give up without a fight. You're not going to believe what these three did next, and how their desperation to maintain control led them to make the mistake that would ultimately destroy them. The knock on Sarah's door came on a Tuesday evening, just as she was finishing dinner. Through the peephole, she saw Margaret Whitfield, Robert Blackstone, and Linda Morrison standing on her front porch like a delegation of neighborhood enforcers. Margaret held a clipboard, Robert carried his ever-present tablet, and Linda clutched a thick folder that looked like it contained legal documents. Sarah opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. Margaret announced that the board had come to conduct their required property inspection and demanded that Sarah provide immediate access to her backyard. When Sarah asked to see the written notice and credentials that her attorney had explained were required for any legitimate inspection, Margaret's demeanor shifted from official to hostile. The HOA president declared that Sarah's legal games were preventing the board from fulfilling their fiduciary duty to the community, and that continued obstruction would result in additional fines and possible legal action. Sarah calmly explained that she would be happy to accommodate a properly scheduled inspection conducted by qualified professionals during normal business hours, as outlined in the community covenant. She also mentioned that her attorney had advised her to record any interactions with the board for legal documentation purposes. The mention of recording equipment had an immediate effect on all three board members. Robert Blackstone took a step backward. Linda Morrison suddenly found the contents of her folder intensely interesting, and Margaret Whitfield's official tone disappeared entirely. What happened next would have been comical if it hadn't been so revealing of the board's true motivations. Margaret announced that the inspection couldn't be delayed because they had credible reports that Sarah was operating an illegal business in her backyard. When Sarah asked for details about these reports, Robert Blackstone claimed that neighbors had complained about excessive traffic and commercial activity related to Sarah's vegetable garden. This is where you will see just how far some people will go when their authority is challenged and they're desperate to maintain control. Sarah was genuinely confused by the commercial activity accusation until Linda Morrison clarified that giving vegetables to neighbors constituted unauthorized commercial distribution that violated the community's residential use restrictions. According to Linda's interpretation, sharing tomatoes from her garden made Sarah an unlicensed agricultural business operating in violation of zoning laws. The absurdity of the claim was matched only by the seriousness with which the three board members presented it. They had convinced themselves that Sarah's generosity with her garden produce was actually an elaborate scheme to circumvent HOA regulations and establish a commercial enterprise in a residential community. But Margaret Whitfield wasn't finished. She informed Sarah that the board had also received security concerns about the privacy fence, creating blind spots that could be used to conceal illegal activity. The only way to address these security concerns was through regular, unannounced inspections of the backyard area. Sarah realized that she was dealing with people who had lost all connection to reality. The fence they wanted removed was creating privacy that they believed was being used for illegal purposes. The vegetables she shared with neighbors were evidence of commercial activity, and the legal advice she had sought was evidence of obstruction and bad faith. The conversation ended with Margaret delivering an ultimatum: provide gate access within 24 hours or face escalated enforcement action that would include liens against the property and potential legal action to force compliance. Sarah closed the door and immediately called David Park, who listened to her account of the evening's events with a mixture of professional interest and genuine amazement. David had seen aggressive HOA boards before, but the Willowbrook Estates situation was approaching parody. David's advice was simple: let them make the next move, but document everything. If the board was desperate enough to make threats they couldn't legally enforce, they might also be desperate enough to take actions that would expose them to serious legal liability. What the board did next will show you exactly why desperate people make the most dangerous enemies and the most vulnerable targets. The escalated enforcement action began at 6 o'clock the following morning, when Sarah was awakened by the sound of someone rattling her back gate. She looked out her bedroom window and saw Robert Blackstone with a bolt cutter attempting to cut the lock on her gate. Sarah grabbed her phone and began recording as she called out to Robert from her bedroom window. When he realized he was being observed, Robert claimed that he was conducting an emergency inspection based on reports of structural damage to the fence that posed a safety hazard to the community. Sarah informed Robert that she was calling the police and continued recording as he abandoned his attempt to cut the lock and retreated to his car. But instead of leaving the area, Robert parked across the street and began taking photographs of Sarah's house with a telephoto lens. The police arrived within 10 minutes, and Sarah provided them with the video she had recorded of Robert's attempted break-in. The responding officer was familiar with HOA disputes and explained that regardless of any covenant provisions, property owners have the right to secure their private property and to exclude unwanted visitors. The officer approached Robert, who was still parked across the street, and informed him that photographing private property without permission could constitute harassment under state law. Robert claimed that he was documenting covenant violations for official HOA business, but the officer explained that official business didn't include attempting to cut locks or conducting surveillance from public streets. By the time the police had finished taking statements and Robert had been sent on his way, Sarah's quiet residential street had attracted the attention of neighbors who had never seen police cars in Willowbrook Estates. Word spread quickly that there had been some kind of break-in attempt, and by evening Sarah's phone was ringing with calls from concerned neighbors asking if she was safe. This is where Sarah discovered that she was not the only homeowner who had problems with the HOA board's increasingly aggressive tactics. The calls from neighbors revealed a pattern of behavior that Sarah hadn't been aware of. Margaret Whitfield had been using her position as HOA president to conduct what amounted to surveillance operations against homeowners she perceived as problematic. She had been photographing properties from public areas, measuring landscaping features with a tape measure, and even following homeowners to document their activities. Linda Morrison had been equally creative in her enforcement efforts. She had been researching property records, cross-referencing permit applications, and building files on homeowners who had submitted multiple requests for architectural modifications. Her goal seemed to be creating a comprehensive database of potential violations that could be used to pressure homeowners into compliance. But it was Robert Blackstone's behavior that concerned neighbors most. Several homeowners reported seeing him walking slowly through the neighborhood with his camera, stopping to photograph houses, cars, and landscaping. One neighbor had found Robert measuring her driveway at 7 o'clock in the morning, claiming that he needed to verify that her car wasn't parked in violation of setback requirements. Sarah realized that her fence dispute had exposed a much larger problem. The HOA board had become so obsessed with control that they were systematically harassing anyone who dared to question their authority. David Park's reaction to Sarah's report was immediate and decisive. The board's behavior had crossed the line from aggressive enforcement into potential criminal activity, and it was time to go on the offensive. You're about to witness the moment when the hunters become the hunted, and see how three bullies learned that their victims could fight back harder than they ever imagined. David's strategy was elegantly simple. Use the HOA's own rules to destroy the HOA board. If Margaret, Robert, and Linda wanted to play games with covenant interpretation, David would show them what real legal analysis looked like. The first step was a comprehensive audit of every action taken by the board over the past 2 years. David requested copies of all board meeting minutes, all violation notices issued, all fines imposed, and all architectural modification requests approved or denied. Under state law, homeowners were entitled to access these records, and the HOA was required to provide them within 30 days. The board's response to David's records request revealed just how far they had strayed from legitimate HOA governance. Many board meetings had been held without proper notice to homeowners, violation notices had been issued without proper documentation, and fines had been imposed without following the dispute resolution procedures outlined in the covenant. But David's most significant discovery came from analyzing the architectural modification records. Margaret Whitfield had approved dozens of fence installations over the past 5 years, and many of those approvals had been granted for fences that were identical to Sarah's in every relevant respect. The board's claim that they lacked authority to approve fence installations was contradicted by their own records. More damning was the evidence that the board had been selectively enforcing covenant provisions based on personal preferences rather than consistent application of community standards. Homeowners who attended board meetings and volunteered for community activities were rarely cited for violations, while homeowners who kept to themselves or questioned board decisions were subjected to intensive scrutiny. David's analysis revealed that the Willowbrook Estates HOA board had been operating less like a legitimate governing body and more like a neighborhood protection racket, using their authority to reward friends and punish enemies. Armed with this evidence, David filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, alleging that the HOA board was operating outside its legal authority and was engaging in systematic harassment of homeowners. The complaint requested that the state investigate the board's activities and consider sanctions against individual board members. But David's most devastating weapon was still to come, and it was hidden in plain sight in the community covenant. This is where Sarah's story reaches its climax, and where 3 people who thought they were untouchable learned that karma has perfect aim. The legal earthquake that brought down the Willowbrook Estates HOA board began with a single paragraph buried on page 53 of the Community Covenant. David Park had discovered Section 15.7, a provision that none of the board members seemed to be aware existed, despite their claims to have memorized every word of the governing documents. Section 15.7 was titled Board Member Accountability, and it established strict standards for board conduct. According to this section, any board member who abused their position, exceeded their authority, or engaged in harassment of homeowners could be removed from office through a special recall election. The section also provided that any homeowner who had been subjected to improper board actions could seek compensation for damages, including attorney fees and costs. But the most beautiful part of Section 15.7 was its definition of improper board actions. The list included demanding access to private property without legal justification, imposing fines without following proper procedures, and conducting surveillance of homeowners without legitimate cause. Margaret Whitfield, Robert Blackstone, and Linda Morrison had violated every single provision of Section 15.7, and they had done so in ways that were thoroughly documented through their own correspondence and actions. David's strategy was to use Section 15.7 to force a complete reorganization of the HOA board. But first he needed to ensure that enough homeowners understood what had been happening in their community. The solution was a detailed report that he distributed to every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates. outlining the board's illegal activities and explaining their rights under the community covenant. The report was a masterpiece of legal documentation and neighborly communication. David had taken complex legal concepts and presented them in language that any homeowner could understand. He had included copies of relevant documents, photographs of board members conducting surveillance, and a timeline showing how the harassment had escalated over time. What happened when the entire community learned the truth about their HOA board will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to stand up to bullies. The response from the community was swift and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of receiving David's report, more than 60 homeowners had contacted Sarah to share their own stories of harassment, illegal fines, and abuse of authority by the board. Margaret Whitfield had been targeting homeowners who installed solar panels, claiming that they violated the architectural uniformity provisions of the covenant, despite the fact that state law protected homeowners' right to install renewable energy systems. Robert Blackstone had been conducting what amounted to stalking behavior, photographing homeowners' daily activities and building files on their comings and goings. One neighbor discovered that Robert had been documenting when she walked her dog, when she left for work, and when she received deliveries. Linda Morrison had been using her position as treasurer to delay approval of legitimate expense reimbursements for homeowners who had questioned board decisions, while fast-tracking payments for homeowners who supported the board's agenda. The pattern of abuse was systematic, well-documented, and completely contrary to the board's fiduciary duty to serve the community's best interests. Armed with evidence from dozens of homeowners, David Park filed a comprehensive lawsuit against all 3 board members, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, harassment, and violation of state laws governing HOA operations. The lawsuit sought damages for every homeowner who had been affected by the board's illegal actions, including Sarah's legal fees and the emotional distress caused by months of harassment. But David's most brilliant legal maneuver was still to come, and it involved using the HOA's own covenant provisions to ensure that the board members would be personally liable for any damages awarded. This is where the story reaches its most satisfying conclusion, and where 3 bullies learned that actions have consequences they never anticipated. The lawsuit had an immediate effect on the board's behavior. Margaret Whitfield stopped issuing violation notices entirely, Robert Blackstone's surveillance activities ceased, and Linda Morrison began responding to homeowner requests with uncharacteristic speed and courtesy. But the damage to their credibility was already done, and the community's response was devastating. A group of homeowners organized a recall election for all 3 board positions, and the results were a landslide. Margaret Whitfield lost by a margin of 87 votes to 12, Robert Blackstone managed only 9 votes in his favor, and Linda Morrison received just 6 votes from the entire community. The new board's first action was to formally apologize to every homeowner who had been harassed by the previous board and to announce that all disputed fines would be waived. Sarah's fence violation fines, which had theoretically accumulated to over $40,000, were dismissed entirely, and she received a formal letter confirming that her fence was in full compliance with community standards. But the financial consequences for the former board members were just beginning. David Park's lawsuit was settled out of court for an amount that was never publicly disclosed, but court records indicate that Margaret Whitfield, Robert Blackstone, and Linda Morrison were each required to pay substantial damages to affected homeowners. The settlement also included provisions requiring each former board member to attend education sessions on proper HOA governance and to refrain from seeking any position of authority in homeowner associations for a period of 5 years. The state attorney general's investigation resulted in formal sanctions against all 3 former board members and led to new state regulations governing HOA board conduct. The Willowbrook Estates case became a precedent that has been cited in dozens of subsequent HOA disputes across the state. But the real victory in this story goes beyond legal settlements and recall elections. It's about what happened to the community itself. The exposure of the former board's abusive behavior had an unexpected positive effect on Willowbrook Estates. Homeowners who had been afraid to participate in community activities because they didn't want to attract the board's attention suddenly became engaged and active. The new board implemented transparent governance procedures, regular community meetings, and clear processes for handling disputes. Property values, which the former board had claimed to be protecting through their aggressive enforcement, actually increased after the recall election, as the community became known as a place where homeowners' rights were respected and where neighbors looked out for each other. Sarah's vegetable garden became the centerpiece of a community-wide gardening initiative, with neighbors sharing seeds, tools, and produce in a spirit of cooperation that would have horrified the former board. Her fence, which had once been the subject of $40,000 in fines, became a model for other homeowners who wanted to add privacy features to their properties. Margaret Whitfield moved out of Willowbrook Estates 6 months after the recall election, selling her house at a loss and relocating to a community where her reputation hadn't preceded her. Robert Blackstone stopped his daily drives through the neighborhood and took up bird watching, a hobby that kept him busy without requiring him to harass his neighbors. Linda Morrison eventually apologized to Sarah personally and admitted that she had allowed her desire for control to override her common sense. The lesson from Sarah's story extends far beyond HOA disputes and speaks to a fundamental truth about power, authority, and the courage required to stand up to bullies. Sarah Chen had moved to Willowbrook Estates looking for a peaceful place to grow tomatoes and enjoy her backyard. She never intended to become a legal warrior or a champion of homeowners' rights. But when faced with people who abused their authority and tried to intimidate her into submission, she discovered reserves of strength and determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The key to Sarah's victory wasn't superior legal knowledge or unlimited financial resources. It was her refusal to be intimidated and her willingness to seek help from people who understood how to fight back effectively. Too many homeowners submit to HOA harassment because they believe they have no choice, but Sarah's story proves that bullies are often much weaker than they appear. David Park's legal strategy succeeded because he understood that the best way to fight abusive authority is often to hold that authority accountable to its own rules. The Willowbrook Estates board members had convinced themselves that they were above the covenant provisions that governed everyone else, but Section 15.7 proved that nobody is immune from consequences when they abuse their power. The broader impact of Sarah's case has been felt throughout the HOA industry, where her story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and selective enforcement. HOA management companies now regularly cite the Willowbrook Estates case when training new board members about the importance of following proper procedures and treating homeowners with respect. But perhaps the most important lesson from this story is about the power of community and what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being pushed around. Sarah's fence dispute could have remained an isolated conflict between one homeowner and 3 power-hungry board members. Instead,